Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the spatial and temporal changes in food webs of rivers in northeast Iceland. So my project mainly focuses on looking at the food web, and as you can see here, this is a very simple diagram of what a food web looks like. On the top, we have the salmon, in the middle, we have the insects, and at the bottom, we have the algae. And basically, these arrows represent the energy transfer between these different organisms. And so we have the salmon eating the insects eating the algae. And so depending on how these different species and organisms utilize their resources, it therefore affects their growth and density. So my main research questions are, what is the invertebrate composition and prey choice of juvenile Atlantic salmon? And how does a simplistic food web like in Vesturdalsá, Iceland, differ temporally and spatially within a river? So as you can see, these are my four study rivers, Selau, Hofsá, Mifrau, and Vesturdalsá. And as you can see here, I use a whole extensive number of methods that help me understand what is happening exactly in the food web. And so each of these methods help cover an aspect of the food web, and so we'll be looking at the results now. So here we see the abundance of invertebrates, difference between taxonomic groups here on the left, and on the right we see the difference in abundance across different rivers. And so all of these graphs are on a log scale on the y-axis. It's log abundance per area. And on the top, we see the abundance that are found in the river drifting in the river column. And in the bottom, we see the abundances of invertebrates found in the bottom substrate of the river. And so what we notice immediately is that the chironomids have the highest abundance found in all these rivers. And water chironomids are the non-biting midges that we see very commonly here. And the next highest abundance are freshwater worms. And when we compare the abundances found of invertebrates across the rivers, we notice that River Midfrau has a much lower abundance compared to the other rivers. Next, we're going to look at the stomach samples and what exactly are the salmon eating. And so what we have again here on the y-axis is a log scale of log abundance of prey items consumed. And as we can see here on the x, this is actually weight classes of juvenile Atlantic salmon. So we have on the left the smaller salmon and on the right the larger salmon. And so what we see here is River Vesturdalsá has the lowest amount of prey being consumed in comparison to the other rivers, and also that the abundances also vary between sizes of fish, and that we notice that smaller fish tend to have a more diversified diet, whereas larger fish tend to eat mainly non-biting midges, the chironomids. Next, we want to actually see whether these juvenile Atlantic salmon are actually selecting for certain prey items over the other. And so we use a selectivity index. And this is the index that we use. And each of these graphs shows a dotted line. And that dotted line represents the neutral selectivity. And so if the prey item is on that line, then it means that they're not necessarily selecting for the item or avoiding it. And if it's above, then they have a high preference for it, and if it's below, then they may avoid it. So we see that selectivity varies across the different rivers. And we also, when we want to focus on just the prey item itself, we look at the non-biting midges, and we see that they're very close to the neutral line, and meaning that they're actually just eating the non-biting midges because there is actually just so much of it in our rivers here. And next, we look at the freshwater worms, and they're also sitting quite close to the neutral line and even slightly below it. But we notice, most importantly, that they seem to have a high preference for large dipteras, and those are like black flies, and they seem to prefer to eat those. Next, I'll be looking at the food webs across River Vesturdalsá, across space and time. Again, here we have the food web. And so here on the left is a graph of the food web. On the y-axis, we have the log abundance. X is the log individual biomass. And as we can see here, the green represents the algae, the blue represents the invertebrates, and the purple represents the salmonids that we see in the river. And each of these dots represents a species, and each of these species have a link in between them that represents the predator and prey relationship between them. And so I'm looking at the difference in the food web across space and time. So we have the space here, which is from site A to E, from downstream all the way to upstream, and of course sampling over time over 4 different time points. So looking at how the food web changes across sites in August, we see here, this is from downstream to an upstream site. The food web, as you can see, it changes and it shifts, and that is mainly driven by the difference in the abundance and the biomass of these different species and organisms. And so what that tells us is that it could give us indicators of the rate of biomass being depleted in the river, as well as the amount of resources to consumers. So basically, we see as we go from downstream to upstream, we see that there is an increase in biomass depletion, decrease, then increase in the middle of the river with the highest, and then a decrease as we go further upstream. And what's interestingly is that the amount of resources increases as we go further upstream, and then it's the highest as we get into site C, which is the middle of the stream, and it decreases again as we go further upstream. But relatively across the rivers, consumer levels seems to remain relatively the same in regards to the ratio to resources. Next, we'll be looking at the food web across time. This is in Site B in Vedahus, if you've been to River Västerdalså, and this is one of our downstream sites. So as we go across the summer period, we see that amount of biomass being depleted increases early in the summer, decreases late in July, and it increases again in August. And also, the most interesting thing that I want to point out here is that actually during June and July, we see a decrease in the amount of resources with an increase in the amount of consumers. And this is actually during the period of the smoke migration period that we have. And therefore, this could be an explanation for why we see an increase in the amount of consumers and a decrease in the amount of resources, as most of the fish are further situated downstream of the river. And as you can see here in August, when most of the fish have migrated, then we see that the amount of resources spring back again, and we have increase and a decrease in the level of consumers. Looking at the upstream site here in Högstäder, we see that over time, we have fluctuations in biomass depletion across time. And what is interestingly is that resource increases as we go further in the early summer, but then it decreases in August, which is the exact opposite of what we actually saw happen in the downstream site. And interestingly here also, that the amount of consumers relatively stay around the same here. Next, we want to kind of put our river Västerdalså, in a larger context and compare it with the River Froom that Rasmus has mentioned. And so what we see here is the 2 different rivers. And we see that River Västerdalså has a much simpler food web in comparison. We see that River Västerdalså have much less diversity of invertebrates in comparison to the Froom here. And one of that could be driven by the fact that we have very different vegetation types. As you can see, River Froom has a much more riparian vegetation in comparison to River Västerdalså. And also, the type of food that each of these, the salmonids in each of these rivers consume are also different, with the fact that fish in Icelandic rivers tend to have to share more resources with one another, with more of the same type of resources with one another, as they have a much higher dietary niche overlap in comparison to salmonids and fish in the River Froom. So some quick conclusions. Food availability is different between rivers in northeast Iceland. Smaller fish have more diversified diet, and the main food choice for juvenile salmon is non-biting midges, and the salmon in the northernmost European distribution consume the most abundant prey available due to a low prey diversity and options than their southern counterparts in Europe. and the food web varies spatially and temporally, and that management should focus on freshwater food production and consider that salmonids, they need diversified food and habitat options in the river, and that those needs will also change over time. I'd like to thank everyone that has supported this project, and I'd like to thank you guys for listening. Thank you.